Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. We love diving into those Cold War stories, and today we've got one that sounds like it's straight out of a spy movie. Top secret documents, KGB, and get this, an explosion so big they could see it from space.
Yeah, this one's a doozy, and it really shows that the Cold War was about way more than just, nuclear weapons. In the 70s, the U.S. and the Soviets were in this crazy race for, who could get the best technology.
It was an intense rivalry, for sure. And the thing is, the Soviets were kind of lagging behind, especially with computers and all those new microelectronics, right?
Exactly. They had to find a way to catch up, so they set up this massive program. They called it Line X. Think of it like a super organized effort to, steal Western technology.
Straight up stealing, huh?
Oh, yeah. And they weren't picky. Anything they could get their hands on, they took. Radar systems, computer designs, even blueprints for machine tools and semiconductors, you name it.
So basically, the U.S. was running in this tech race, but the Soviets were, cheating the whole time.
Pretty much. And the scary part is, from what we've gathered, Line X was working really well for a while. The U.S. was basically competing against itself without even knowing it.
I bet that was a nasty surprise. So how'd they even find out about all this?
That's where the Farewell Dossier comes in. It's this collection of thousands of KGB documents leaked by a Soviet engineer, Colonel Vladimir Vetrov, codename Farewell.
Farewell. That's a interesting choice for a code name.
It is, isn't it? But yeah, this guy had access to everything. His job was actually to evaluate all the stolen tech. But get this, instead of being thrilled about all this success, he started getting really disillusioned with the Soviet system.
I guess all that stealing would make anyone feel a little dirty.
Well, it wasn't even about that. He wasn't motivated by money or anything. From what we can tell, he genuinely believed that the Soviet system was failing its people. He thought it was headed in the wrong direction.
So what do? Walk into the U.S. Embassy with a briefcase full of secrets?
Not quite, but close. Starting in 1980, he started handing over all these super sensitive documents to the French intelligence service. Identities of over 200 KGB agents in the West, what they were targeting, their methods, the whole shebang.
I can only imagine what that must have been like for the French. Like winning the lottery, but with espionage.
You could say that. The Farewell Dossier was like a bomb going off. It gave Western intelligence this unbelievable insight into how Line X worked and showed them just how much the Soviets had stolen, how dependent they were on it.
So what did they do? Did they just, arrest all those KGB agents right away?
That's what you'd think, right? Blow the whole thing wide open. But President Reagan and his people, they saw another way, a much more, let's call it clever way. Instead of shutting down Line X, they decided to use it against the Soviets.
Oh, that sounds interesting. Tell me more.
They decided to play the long game. They started feeding the KGB bad designs, flawed software made to look like the real deal.
Like setting a trap.
Exactly. A really elaborate, high-stakes trap. Imagine it like slipping a bug into the code, a tiny flaw in the blueprints that wouldn't be obvious at first, but would eventually cause big, big problems.
I'm starting to see where that explosion comes in. But did they have American companies helping out with this? Seems a little risky.
Oh, yeah. They had some, let's say, enthusiastic companies on board with the plan, and they came up with some pretty creative ways to mess with the Soviets.
So what kind of chaos did they cause? Give us the good stuff.
Well, one of the most incredible examples is this massive pipeline the Soviets were building, the Trans-Siberian Pipeline, this huge project for them. They were desperate to automate it, but they couldn't make the software they needed, so naturally...
They went shopping. Line X, here we come.
Bingo! They got their hands on the software, no clue that the CIA had tampered with the code, and, you can probably guess what happened next.
It blew up.
Oh, it blew up, all right. In 1982, that doctored code caused this massive explosion in Siberia.
Wow. I bet that made the news.
You bet. It was one of the biggest non-nuclear explosions ever. They could see it from space. And the craziest part is, it seems like it happened way out in the middle of nowhere, so no one got hurt. At least not directly.
That's a relief, I guess. But still, what a mess. So the pipeline was just the start, right?
Right. This bad tech was going everywhere into all sorts of Soviet projects. And it wasn't just big, flashy things like pipelines. Remember, they were trying to catch up in computing power, too. So the KGB was busy snatching up all the latest chips they could find.
But instead of getting a boost, they got a bunch of duds.
Exactly. The U.S. operations swapped out those chips with faulty ones that would just malfunction randomly. And guess where those chips ended up?
Their military equipment.
Not exactly the kind of reliability you want when you're dealing with, weapons systems.
So did this almost lead to Like a major accident or something?
That's a good question. It's hard to say for sure, but it seems the U.S. was pretty careful about how they designed these flaws. They weren't trying to cause, like, a full-blown disaster.
They were going for confusion and chaos then.
Right. The goal was to make the Soviets doubt everything they thought they knew about Western tech. It was a really brilliant, if a little risky, plan.
And did it work?
It did. The Soviets were totally baffled. They had this huge spy network, a history of successful espionage. They never thought the U.S. would be feeding them bad intel on this scale.
But they eventually had to figure it out, right? Like, someone must notice something was seriously wrong.
Well, that's actually where things take a turn for the tragic. It was actually Farewell's own undoing that brought the whole operation to light.
Oh, wow.
In 1982, totally separate from his spying, he got arrested for an incident with a woman and another KGB officer. And during the investigation, they found out about his spying.
That's awful. What happened to him?
He was executed in 1985, a tragic end for someone who, in his own way, was trying to do what he thought was right.
What a story. But even though his spying ended abruptly, it sounds like he really set things in motion.
Oh, absolutely. Once Farewell was exposed, the U.S. and its allies were able to take down that whole Line X network he'd revealed. It was a massive blow to Soviet intelligence, all because of one engineer who decided he'd had enough.
It's crazy to think one guy could cause so much chaos. But did all this really change the course of the Cold War? I mean, was the Farewell Dossier that important?
It was definitely a huge win for the West, that's for sure. The Farewell Dossier gave them this incredible peek behind the curtain of the Soviet system, showed just how much they relied on stolen tech.
So the Soviets were kind of stuck. Right, they thought they were getting ahead by stealing, but it blew up in their face.
Exactly. And the timing couldn't have been worse for them. I mean, the Soviet Union in the 80s was already a mess, economically speaking. Couldn't keep up with the U.S. military spending, and their industry was, well, let's just say it was stuck in the past.
So Line X wasn't just some side hustle. They really needed that stolen tech to keep the whole system from falling apart.
That's one of the biggest things the Farewell Dossier showed us. They weren't just trying to catch up, they were desperately treading water. They needed Western tech, especially for computers and microelectronics, just to function.
And bam, suddenly they can't trust anything. Like building a house on a foundation of sand, the whole thing's got to be shaky.
Exactly. The Farewell Dossier created this atmosphere of paranoia, like who do you trust? They couldn't tell what was real, what was going to backfire. It slowed down everything. Their research, their development, you name it. They were second-guessing every new piece of tech.
And during all of this, Reagan's ramping up U.S. defense spending, throwing money at Star Wars. Talk about twisting the knife.
It really was a perfect storm for the Soviets. Economy in the tank, technology unreliable, and now they're up against an opponent with even better tech and a bigger wallet.
Hold on, though. The Soviet Union didn't just collapse overnight, right? Was the Farewell Dossier really the knockout punch? What about everything else that was going on?
You're right, it wasn't the only factor. Saying the Farewell Dossier single-handedly brought down the Soviet Union would be a bit of a stretch. There were internal struggles like economic stagnation, political crackdowns, and all that rising nationalism in the republics. It was complicated.
It was a pretty big hit, right? They can't deny that.
Oh, absolutely. It exposed just how vulnerable the Soviet system was, made their tech problems even worse, and basically shattered their confidence. Some historians even say it was a major factor in the Soviet Union finally calling it quits in '91.
So Farewell might not get all the credit, but his actions definitely sent some serious shockwaves. Went way beyond just messing up pipelines and chips.
No doubt about it. It's a fascinating example of how one person's actions can have these huge unintended consequences, especially in the world of spies and secrets. It really highlights how important intelligence and counterintelligence are in shaping history.
Okay, so we've talked about the impact on the Soviets, but what about the U.S.? What did they learn from all of this?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway was that the Soviets were better at spying than they'd thought. It was a wake-up call, like, hey, these guys are serious about getting our tech, and they'll do whatever it takes.
It sounds like they were playing a whole different game.
Exactly. The Farewell Dossier forced the U.S. to rethink their security. They had to step up their counterintelligence game big time, realized they needed to protect their intellectual property, their critical infrastructure, not just from armies and bombs, but from spies, too.
But it also showed them how powerful deception can be, right? Turning the Soviets' own spy network against them is some next-level stuff.
It really was. Fighting fire with fire, using their strength against them. It shows how important creativity and thinking outside the box is in the intelligence world. Sometimes the best defense is a good offense.
But wasn't there a risk this could have gone too far? What if that pipeline had blown up in a city? What if those faulty chips caused a huge military accident?
Those are good questions, and they definitely raise some tough ethical issues. It's true, the U.S. operation was a gamble.
So even during the Cold War, with all that tension, were there lines the U.S. wouldn't cross? Like, were there limits on what was acceptable, even against an enemy like the Soviet Union?
I think so. The Farewell Dossier and the U.S. response to it showed just how morally complex espionage is and how you can get these unintended consequences. Even the best plans can go wrong. It's a reminder that even in conflict, there have to be limits.
Seems like we're left with more questions than answers, especially about how far is too far in the world of espionage. But those are questions we've got to keep asking, even today.
Absolutely. The Farewell Dossier might be a Cold War story, but the lessons it teaches us are just as important now in the 21st century.
Well, on that note, let's bring things up to date. What can we learn from the Farewell Dossier about today's tech world? It's kind of wild how a story from way back then can still feel so relevant, right? Back in the Cold War, it was the Soviets trying to steal tech. Who's doing it now?
You know, in a lot of ways, it's the same game, just different players. We've still got state-sponsored actors trying to snag sensitive info, tech, all that.
Okay, so instead of the KGB, we're dealing with who?
Think like state-backed hacking groups, cyber espionage units, even criminal organizations, but with, a government pulling the strings. They're after intellectual property, military secrets, anything that gives them a leg up.
And it's not just about blueprints anymore, right? The digital world's got to be a goldmine for these guys.
Absolutely. Think about it. We create mountains of data every single day. Financial stuff, personal messages, how to run power grids. It's all out there, and it's all vulnerable.
So cybersecurity and counterintelligence are even more important now. It's like the Cold War just, went online.
That's a good way to put it. And the Farewell Dossier, it actually gives us some pretty useful tips on how to handle all this.
Like what? Spill the beans.
Well, first off, got to be proactive. The U.S. won that round because they were thinking ahead, anticipating what the Soviets would do. Turn the tables on them. So today, that means strong cybersecurity, always watching for threats and coming up with new ways to fight back, counterintelligence.
And we've got to be careful about being tricked, right? Not just by our enemies, but by anyone trying to, twist the truth for their own benefit.
Oh, for sure. That's another big lesson from the Farewell Dossier. Disinformation's a powerful tool. Got to be critical of what we see and hear. Just because it looks real doesn't mean it is. Double check those sources, and if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
Farewell also shows how important it is to work together. The U.S. teamed up with its allies to take down Line X. We got to do the same now, right?
Absolutely. Cyber threats don't care about borders. We've got to share info, coordinate our defenses, show a united front against anyone trying to mess with us.
It's easy to get caught up in the whole spy thriller aspect of Farewell, but it's important to remember there were real people involved, real lives affected by all this.
Yeah, you can't forget that. Colonel Vetrov's story is a real tragedy. He risked it all to do what he thought was right, and he paid the ultimate price. Even in the spy world, there's a human cost, and we got to remember that.
And it shows that even in our digital world, one person can still make a difference. Someone who follows their conscience can set off a chain of events that changes everything.
The Farewell Dossier isn't just some Cold War story. It's about that fight between freedom and control, the power of technology, and the choices we make when things get tough. It's a story with a lot to say, even all these years later.
It's definitely given us a lot to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Farewell Dossier. We hope you found it as interesting as we did. And until next time, stay curious and stay safe out there.